was quite a surprise to me when I think by the end of the day we had 55. That wasn't something that I had anticipated or expected in any way.
So was there a queue in the Commons Library to get to the printer?
Pretty much. And it was a very surreal experience that day.
Robin Casper-Walker, Conservative MP for Worcester. Welcome to your exit interview, a chance for us both to learn what you could have done better. So, Robin, the same question I've asked everyone in their exit interviews, first of all, why are you leaving us?
For me, it's mainly about family. It's mainly about wanting to be in one place. And I've had an amazing time over the last 14 years. A lot has happened. I've been able to be a minister, a select committee chair, and a backbencher, and I've loved each of those for the opportunities that they brought. But I felt that with young children, I wanted to be able to stay in one place and not be either leaving them during the week to be in Westminster or vice versa, leaving them to go to the constituency, be campaigning every weekend. So for me, it was a very personal decision. It was one which is about making sure that my family could all stay together all of the time. I remember well my father's advice about going into politics, which was to make an absolute fortune before you do it, which rings more true to me now at the end of the thing than perhaps it did when I was a young, free and single man in my 20s trying to get into politics.
So let's deal with those two things. We'll do your children, then we'll do your father afterwards. It's interesting you say that because this has come up quite a lot, actually, doing this series. And you became an MP in 2010. Even at that point, there was talk about making it more family-friendly and changing the hours and blah, blah, blah. Is it just impossible, actually, to have anything resembling a family life while you're working, essentially, often in two different ends of the country?
It's definitely challenging, and I think some families manage to do it brilliantly. They're incredibly supportive. They manage to move backwards and forwards, or they manage to anchor themselves in one place. For me, I've always wanted to be able to see my children every day. And that means that you've either got to spend a lot of time with them in the car, driving backwards and forwards to a constituency, or you've got to arrange things so that you can come back and be in one place. And there's no perfect solution. For some colleagues I know, their families stay in the constituency and they're away from them 3 days of the week, but then they're back with them over the weekend. For others, the family are based more in London, and then you have the advantage of being able to see them on early weekday mornings, which is more the approach we've taken. When I was a child, we did travel backwards and forwards to the constituency, but that was going up on a Friday afternoon and coming back on a Sunday. And I remember very well having the sudden realization, aged about 13, that a weekend was supposed to consist of 2 whole days, because I'd always assumed that it was only Saturday and Sunday morning.
And so let's talk about that then, because I think you're the first person who's done an exit interview who had a parent who was also an MP. Your dad, Peter Walker, fought 9 elections between 1961 and 1992. So what was that like growing up, like you said, with an MP in the household? And my impression would be that it would put you off the idea of a career in politics rather than draw you closer to it.
I think that's probably right in most circumstances, and I'm one of 5 children, and none of the other 4 went into politics. I think I was just the right age not to be put off, actually. I was 14 when my father retired from frontline politics. I still found it all quite exciting and quite sort of lively. I used to like to go along to meetings and see what was happening and that side of things. Maybe I hadn't seen some of the downsides and some of the challenges in the way that perhaps my older siblings had. But I think it's also, it's about different types of personality. And I think that is something that, I've always been attracted to the campaigning side, the doorstep side of politics. I've always found that really exciting. But I know some of my siblings wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. So there's horses for courses in that respect. And I think it's also about understanding what it's there for. And for me, one of the things, when my father was in politics, I was probably too young to understand it in a great deal of detail. But one of the things that sort of brought it home to me was actually the first time I volunteered. I went to go and work for an MP. I was working for Oliver Letwin in the 2005 campaign, and he was target of a very high-profile, what they called at the time, decapitation campaign, where they were trying to get rid of him as the Shadow Chancellor. And what won him his constituency, where I ended up spending most of the 2005 election, was not that he was a Tory or that he was the Shadow Chancellor. It was the fact that so many people who weren't necessarily politically committed were people he had helped. And it was seeing that switched something on with me and made me think, yes, I want to do this, and actually made me understand better why people always said nice things about my father and why that all meant something. And so it was that sort of fired me up to want to go in to politics and try and make that difference.
And given that you're obviously, you were young growing up, you'd probably thought, I know a bit more about what all this politics involves than lots of people. How did your experience then coming in 2010, did it match or not match your expectations?
It's a really good question. And I think, to be honest, I probably underestimated my level of ignorance. I think a lot of colleagues assumed when we all arrived together in 2010 that because I came from a political family, I came pre-programmed with a huge knowledge of how everything worked. And I really didn't. And actually, I think it was something, I found it an enormous learning curve. I had, to be honest, naively been looking, bearing in mind where we were at the time with the whole expenses scandal and so on and so forth, I'd naively been looking at this, and in the run-up to having won the election, in the run-up to actually turning up to Parliament, I had in my mind, I'm going to be able to do this all by myself. I'm going to answer all my emails. I'm going to answer all my letters. I don't understand why MPs need staff. All this kind of stuff you'd expect a complete outsider to do. And then on day one, I got hit by this avalanche of letters, emails, a parcel, 2 foot tall, which was left over from my predecessor of letters that needed to be answered, which had come in during the election campaign. And I had a rude awakening to the life of a modern MP. And it took me some time to organise the office, to get the right people working with me, to make sure that could be handled. And I think that was very different between my time and my father's, actually, because whilst the letters were there, undoubtedly, and he had a brilliant team who supported him and helped to answer the letters, of course, in the meantime, email had come along. Electronic communication had made it so much easier for people to get hold of their MPs. And in many ways, that's a good thing. But it certainly does mean that the need to be constantly responsive has stepped up by a degree, I would say, probably of about 10 times since that period, early 90s, when he left government and when I came into Parliament in 2010.
So let's talk then what happened when you came in 2010. The following year, you were one of 81 Tories who rebelled against David Cameron, calling for a referendum on EU membership. Did you think then, in 2011, you were pulling the lever on something that was going to fundamentally change Britain as we know it and put us where we are right now?
I think the honest answer has to be no. I did think it was something fundamentally important. And actually, one of the reasons that I had sort of kept an interest in politics through my 20s and 30s is that I did feel that what happened after Maastricht, when people were promised a referendum and then it wasn't delivered by the then Labour government, was a problem. I thought there was a democratic deficit. I thought there was a need for people to have a genuine say. And I hadn't made up my mind at the stage where I was rebelling for a referendum as to which side of a referendum I would campaign on. I did eventually make up my mind to campaign for Remain, very much on the basis of what I thought were the interests of my constituency at the time, and what I felt was the right thing in terms of having an easier economic road to travel if we stayed in. But I always fundamentally accepted that it had to be a proper decision for the British people. And that's why on day one after the referendum, I said, everyone's got to come together and try and make this work now. We've got to, now that people have decided to leave, we've got to find a way of making that happen. And I didn't necessarily expect that to translate to then becoming a Brexit minister, but it did. And that was then an incredible opportunity to work on something really important. It was unbelievably difficult. It was, as we all know, very, very contentious, and there were all sorts of fallings out along the way. But one of the things that actually I'm proudest of is the way in which lots of people who campaigned on different sides of the referendum came together to actually deliver on the outcome. and that we did eventually deliver on that in a way that didn't realise the worst fears of all the people who had campaigned to remain. And I think that is very important. And I think that was always, I felt a responsibility to try and do that as someone who'd supported a referendum and as someone who saw the intellectual justification for why we had to have a referendum. And that goes way back. I mean, I remember arguing with my father about this when he was very pro EU. And I wrote essays for my A-level politics arguing why there had to be a referendum because neither of the main parties were giving people a real choice. So this is something that was quite deep-rooted and I felt quite strongly about, even though, as I say, I think the question of which side to be on during the referendum debate was a slightly separate one from whether or not we had to have one.
Given what we know now and how the last, 8 years have panned out since the referendum, do you think you were still right? Your concerns about the impact on your constituents, the uncertainty, the untangling and all that, were you right to have backed Remain?
I was right on some of the issues. I mean, I think at the time, I remember talking a lot about the challenges for Northern Ireland. And I think that has been borne out, unfortunately. It's been longer and more difficult to resolve some of those challenges than I think many people on the Leave side expected. But I think probably we were wrong on the big economic argument. And I think we've seen that. And I think we've seen, the UK has actually been one of the more dynamic economies in Europe, albeit in hugely challenging circumstances. We've seen economic growth and we've seen strong trade figures in a way that many people on the Remain side didn't believe would be possible if we left. And part of that was about making sure that we got a deal with the TTA eventually, but with the approach that meant that there was a sensible trade arrangement in place. Part of it was also about some of the smoothing of the way, things like the transition period, which we all take for granted now, but I remember being something we had to push very hard for and argue very hard for at the time. Things like the Citizens' Rights Agreement. Some of that work, I think, was very important to make sure that we could leave the EU in a way that was sustainable and didn't do the sort of damage that people talked about during the Remain campaign. I mean, I also think that the way in which the Remain campaign talked up the fears was counterproductive, and I think it switched many voters in the last few weeks of that campaign to saying, you're just being over the top here and we don't believe you and therefore we're going to vote Leave. There's an interesting post-mortem to be done on that, but fundamentally, I felt at the time I was making the right argument for my constituency. At the end of the day, this was always a democratic process and my constituents decided otherwise. 55% of my constituents voted to Leave. And that's that's democracy. You have to respect that. You have to deliver on that. And that's what I felt myself bound to do.
You mentioned that you were a minister in the Brexit department for 3 years under Theresa May. You were a junior minister in Scotland, then Northern Ireland, Minister of State for Schools. You're now chair of the Education Select Committee, and you've been on and off select committees sort of in between. Where do you think you can, as an individual politician, have the most impact? Is it climbing the lower rungs of the ministerial ladder? Is it as a backbencher causing trouble and rebelling? Is it as a select committee chair? When you come to stand down whenever the election is, which is the bit where you think that was when I really was sort of in the groove and I was changing something?
It's a really interesting question because there are different things you can do in each of those roles. I think, in many ways, being a junior minister can feel very constraining in that you're very much stuck to being able to speak on your brief. You're very much stuck to being able to speak in your policy area. And of course, you don't have the freedom just to make decisions that you might personally like. You have to be able to do it based on advice and within the constraints of Treasury spending priorities and the departmental priorities. So it can feel very constraining, but equally you can still get stuff done behind the scenes. You can make the case for things in your constituency. You can write to colleagues about issues you feel strongly about. You can raise things on a cross-party basis by having conversations with the right people on select committees. So it doesn't stop you from doing that work, but it does make that work significantly less visible. I think being a select committee chair, to me, is a really exciting thing to be able to have that balance of doing things where you're using evidence to make a case for something. You're working with people from all sides of the House and from all different backgrounds to make an evidence-based case for change. You get a hearing because you have that sort of seat of being a select committee chair. And you get very well informed. But to be honest, some of the work of which I'm proudest is work that I did as a backbencher without any of those titles and jobs and accolades. And actually, things like the campaign I led with Justin Tomlinson and a few others on the Conservative benches to make sure that there was Conservative support for putting a cap on high cost lenders and people like Wonga, who at the time were really ripping off a lot of consumers. That's probably one of my proudest things I did in Parliament. And that was just as an ordinary backbencher. I think I made the first backbench amendment to a backbench motion, which is a tiny piece of parliamentary geek history for you, in order to make sure that Conservative colleagues were able to come on board and support some of the work that Stella Creasy had been doing to cap payday lenders. And that then later translated to George Osborne embracing that policy and introducing a cap. So things like that can make a big difference to a lot of people. But of course, the other part of it is, and the part of it I think all of us spend much more time out of the public eye doing than most of the public would ever realise, is the constituency casework, the day-to-day stuff you can do for constituents. And for me, that's just as important, not nearly as prominent, but probably makes a bigger difference to the people you help than almost anything else an MP can do.
I wonder, because actually doing this series, what's been striking is people talk about the times when they felt like they made a change and had an impact and had an effect. Actually, it doesn't fit. This does not feel like a government which is absolutely firing on all cylinders, changing the world right now. I wonder if part of your decision for standing down now is you don't want to stick around for the warfare that will almost certainly follow if there is a Conservative defeat in the next election. Well, it's going to be a rough old time, isn't it?
I've never been particularly interested or excited by faction fighting. That's certainly true. But actually, I don't think anything's inevitable in politics. I do think, we saw it with 22 the other day, colleagues coming together from all sides of the party and saying, actually, we've got to make sure that we put our best foot forward and campaign for a Prime Minister who is the right man to be leading the country forward. I hope that they are able to continue to do that, because that's what I want to see. Actually, part of my thinking about making my announcement when I did is that for the first time in a while, I was comfortable about who was leading our party, and I didn't feel I had to stay around to fight to see the change I wanted. And so that was having obviously resigned from Boris Johnson's government. He had many brilliant qualities, but I think he hadn't, by the end of things, shown that he was the right man to be Prime Minister. Having gone through the period, the slightly bizarre period, I have to say, in which we had this trust leading the party, it wasn't one I was deeply comfortable with, but it was one I recognised the members had chosen. I didn't cause trouble during that period. But having gone through that period, I then felt actually we had someone in charge of the party who I could comfortably feel was the right person to lead the party forward. And part of my reasoning in being able to then say, actually, now is quite a good time to step back, is that I felt that my association would have time to choose a really good candidate, which they've done, and they would be able to take things forward in calmer waters. I hope that we can focus on that, and I hope that we can also focus on a lot of the very good things in our record that I think we do have to point to, because I think sometimes the lack of unity in the pages of the newspapers distracts from that. But I think education is an excellent area where we have a really strong record to point to, rising standards, my constituency, as I think most constituencies in the country, more school places, which were desperately needed, more specialist school places, we need even more, but we have invested in these spaces, more apprenticeships and better outcomes coming out of our schools. That's a really good record, and it's one that I think we need to make sure that colleagues can have confidence in talking about.
It's interesting you talk about that, because actually lots of parents listening to it will think that just doesn't chime with their experience, whether it's school buildings being closed because of concrete which hasn't been treated. It's overworked, overstressed teachers who are leaving the profession. It's the number of kids who aren't in lessons and all the disruption that comes with that. It doesn't feel like a success story to lots of people who are in the education system right now.
And there are big challenges. And one of the things on the Select Committee is that it's our job to highlight those challenges and give ministers of any political colour a challenge over them. And I think that's quite right that we do that. I mean, I think in RAC it's an interesting case in point of a very long-standing issue which the department decided to address and decided to reduce their appetite for risk on, quite rightly, in my view. They stepped in. At the time, the headlines was that we were going to see thousands of schools up and down the country close. And actually, whilst there has been huge disruption to a very, very small number of schools, there hasn't been anything like the disruption that was anticipated or predicted in many quarters. So in some respects, I think Diana Barron has done a really good job getting into the detail of that, making sure that schools do get some good support on that front. And certainly that's what we heard at the Select Committee. Now, we will continue to challenge to make sure that those smaller numbers of schools that continue to be affected get all the support they need, and every pupil can be in face-to-face education. But I think that's an interesting example, perhaps, of one where the government has had a lot of criticism, but actually what they're being criticised for is identifying and addressing a problem which successive governments hadn't picked up, hadn't addressed, and now they provided the investment to do that. So on teacher retention, this is hugely important. We all want to attract and retain brilliant teachers, but I have to say, we look at the political debate on it, and it often gets focused on being a numbers game. I don't think anyone's quite recognised the scale of the challenge in terms of getting the specialists in maths, in physics, in key subjects that we need, when those are also highly competitive markets for anyone with a degree. And so we'll be making some recommendations in the near future. It's a massively important issue. But I have to say, I don't see any of the political parties at the moment coming up with a clear offer on that, which is going to make a big difference. Labour are talking about 6,000 teachers with the proceeds of what they presume they're going to raise from VAT on independent schools. I think they got their sums wrong on raising money at all, but fundamentally, even if they did, 6,000 teachers is a drop in the ocean. It's not going to make a substantial difference to the fact that we need to recruit and retain many, many more. So I think that it's that kind of thing where hopefully party work can do, delving into the detail of these things and providing some challenge can help government and can help departments with the Treasury to make the case for getting investment in the right places.
Robin, you've had a lot of leaders in that time, so let's work our way through them then. Sum them up in a word for us in your exit interview. Can you sum up David Cameron in a word?
It's a really challenging question. I'm sorry, I hadn't prepared for this one. How do I sum up David Cameron in a word? I would say fresh, probably when he started. And then maybe, I can't do it in a single word, but I think probably too sure of himself when it came to referendums.
Very good. Theresa May then, she came in to clear up that mess. Theresa May in a word?
Hardworking and dutiful, 2 words.
Oh, there we are. Hardworking and dutiful. Did you, when you look back on that period when you were one of her Brexit ministers, from the outside, it can feel a bit like those 3 years, an awful lot happened and yet actually nothing happened. We voted to leave as a country in 2016. We didn't leave. And then in 2019, Boris Johnson came along and sorted it out. Is that a fair reflection of the wading through treacle that was 2016 to 2019?
Inevitably not. I mean, I think she always wanted to deliver that balance between delivering on the aspirations of people who wanted to leave, really leaving the European Union, and recognising and addressing the fears of people who voted to remain. And I think that was a very worthy aspiration. I think the challenge is that she was not able to maintain the coalition of the support within the party in order to deliver that all the way through. And levels of trust on both sides of the argument, I think, gradually got eroded. And so I think from the inside, it was very frustrating because we were constantly working towards a goal that we knew we wanted to achieve of leaving with a deal. But the political balance that needed to be achieved in order to deliver that through Parliament kept changing. So it was a very challenging period. I do think that fundamentally the repeated attempts that she made were incredibly worthy. But I remember sitting there on the 3rd meaningful vote when she was launching this and looking at the faces of the people in the audience, looking at the launch and just thinking this is not going to work out well. And doing everything I could to support the approach that was being taken, but knowing really that there was not a political way through at that time. And to his credit, Boris did unblock that, and he got things done. Contrary to some of the people who say, we left on a hard Brexit, we left with a deal, and we left with a deal that meant that transition period worked, that there was a common travel area in Northern Ireland, that there were sensible trading arrangements with which the UK economy has coped very well.
So we go then, if Theresa May was hardworking and dutiful, how would you sum up Boris Johnson?
Brilliant and mercurial, perhaps, would be a good...
Brilliant and mercurial. Were you surprised when you joined his government that you then found yourself resigning, not over some huge policy disagreement, but essentially a more personal disagreement about the way he was behaving in office.
Yes, and to be honest, until the day before I resigned, it was not something that I was thinking about. I will be resigning, and so on and so forth. It was one of those sleepless nights where I genuinely had a long, hard think about where things were, and felt I had to come in and resign. I mean, I think I don't know quite where I come in the official rankings. I think I was the fourth or fifth minister to resign in that sequence. I would have been the third if the printers had been working properly in the library, and so I think it was something that, contrary to certain rumours and sort of books that have been written about this, there was no pre-coordination about the fact, and I genuinely, when I was writing my resignation letter, I expected that I might be the third and only person to be resigning that day. Third person to resign, only person to be resigning the day after Sajid and Rishi had gone. And so it was quite a surprise to me when I think by the end of the day we had 55. That wasn't something that I had anticipated or expected in any way.
So was there a queue in the Commons library to get to the printer?
Pretty much. It was a very surreal experience that day. And it was something that I think, I took the view that I wanted to sort of take my stand and set out my views. I certainly didn't do it with a view that Boris was imminently going to come down as leader, and I think that obviously was the outcome. But that was given the number of people who felt a similar way, and it wasn't something that was my intention when I was writing that letter.
So he goes then to be replaced by Liz Truss. Sum up Liz Truss for us.
Determined, but not in my view someone with the breadth of support or ambition to be able to take our party forward. And I think the challenge that she ran into is that I think she was talking to quite a narrow group of people, and I don't think she was able to hold the parliamentary party together. But I don't think there's much more to say than that. I mean, I remember that moment really when the whipping all fell to pieces, and it was an extraordinary moment, like nothing I've ever seen in Parliament really, where it just seemed that the communication between the centre and the whip's office had broken down completely, and at that moment, I thought this isn't going to last, and sure enough, it didn't.
This was over the fracking vote when it wasn't clear what was happening. What's gone wrong in because you've been around the Conservative Party, man and boy, in one sort of another. What's gone wrong in the Conservative Party that its membership went for the person who, and this has come up time and time again in doing these interviews, was so, to the people who knew her best, her colleagues in Parliament, was so ill-suited to the job. She didn't win a majority amongst MPs going into that race. What's gone wrong with the Conservative Party that the membership who, went for David Cameron, actually went for Boris Johnson, but they used to be the fine, upstanding, sensible people, the quiet, calm Conservatives, and instead blew everything up with Liz Truss. What's gone wrong inside the Conservative Party that meant that could happen?
I don't blame members for what happened. I mean, I think what happened over a period of time is that you had the grassroots, the people who feel very strongly about Conservative policies, feeling that the business of government didn't necessarily result in the outcomes that they wanted to see. And I think that's, to some extent, that's going to happen to any party that's in office over a long period of time. It certainly happened to the Conservative Party during the period of Margaret Thatcher and John Major. And there's a certain amount of, I think, wanting, quote unquote, their party back, and therefore wanting to go for someone who sounded in tone much more conservative and much more strident. I think many of my councillors, many of my activists, members of the party in Worcester were very concerned about that because they recognise in a place like Worcester, you're constantly having conversations with people who come from a different political tradition, have a different political viewpoint. In order to win people, we couldn't just afford to appeal only to the grassroots and only to Conservative supporters. And that was always my conversation with members locally. But I think there was a certain element as well of people wanting to put a marker down, wanting to have their say, and through all of the tensions and challenges that the Brexit process has caused, people wanting to be very clear, we want someone who's sort of purely on our side. Of course, the great irony was that Liz, who was a Remainer, was portrayed as the great Brexit candidate, and Rishi, who was a Leaver, was portrayed as some sort of a Remainer. And so it was a somewhat ironic outcome in that respect. But it was certainly something that I had those conversations with my membership. There were a range of different views amongst my members, and you have to respect the process of a vote by members, which is why, by the way, during that whole period of the Liz Truss government, I wasn't speaking out and trying to make life difficult for them. I had actually done on the fracking vote exactly what I was asked to do, which was to go in and speak on the issue and say I wanted things to change, but not cause trouble with my voting. And then when that whipping fell apart, that just felt deeply painful, especially to those of us who had strong views about it, but had reined them in order to support the party leader.
So then she goes, and along comes Rishi Sunak. So sum up Rishi Sunak in a word for us.
I think competent, ambitious would be two words that spring to mind. I think he's taken on the challenge at a hugely difficult time, but I think what he did during furlough was absolutely phenomenal. What he managed to do to support the economy in that respect, and actually I think a lot of his priorities, in terms of when he talks about education being the closest thing we have to a magic bullet, vital to investing in productivity, when he's had his big push on childcare. When he's invested in things like family hubs, which have been a very good idea for a very long time, but haven't always got the investment and support that they've needed, very much aligned with some of my own thinking, some of my own views. So I'm very comfortable with this man. I think he's the right person to be taking us forward. I think that perhaps unfairly, partly because of his time at the Treasury, partly because of his background in business, I think he has a challenge sometimes communicating that to the wider public. And I think that's where he's got a job to do, but actually he's got a really strong record to talk about in that respect, on being on people's side, and that's something that I would hope comes out more. And I have to say, when it's some time since he's been to my constituency, but he has been to my constituency. He came during the pandemic on factory visits, and he went down incredibly well on the factory floor. He was one of those people, a bit like people sometimes said of former prime ministers, that when people meet him in person, they're generally very, very impressed.
Let's just round off with some classic exit interview questions. You've talked about your proudest moments in the job. What's been the bit of the job you've enjoyed the least?
I think there's two things. One was dealing with the various sort of factions and pressures during the Brexit process over a long period of time did become very wearing, and that whole side of things of going into one room and dealing with people with one view and going into another room and dealing with people with a diametrically opposed view was very challenging. And perhaps on a similar note, one of the most difficult but I think worthwhile and important things I had to do was carrying through the EF Act legislation in Northern Ireland to introduce same-sex marriage and abortion. And that was incredibly difficult, a huge opposition, very strong feelings and deeply held feelings locally. But I think it was the right thing to do. And it was something that we needed to make sure that actually we did make sure that human rights issues were on a level playing field for the UK. It was very uncomfortable and very, very difficult at the time. But I think it was one of those things which was worthwhile taking that pain in order to get it done.
Did you ever have private conversations with politicians in Northern Ireland who actually were quite pleased it was you doing that difficult work? Stormont wasn't sitting and they could just slightly turn a blind eye and let, it was a good thing that this was probably happening, but they weren't going to have to be the ones to do the dirty work?
Well, if there were private conversations, I shouldn't be commenting on them. But I think there was a feeling, but there were certainly some people in Northern Ireland who were glad they didn't have to address this issue. And I mean, I do think it's right that issues of that nature generally should not be whipped. They should not be pushed through by governments. They should be done on a free vote and for members of Parliament. Of course, the huge frustration in Northern Ireland at the time is, as we've seen too often in Northern Ireland, the locally elected members weren't able to have their say because the institutions weren't functioning. And it's great that they are functioning again. From the reports I hear, they're functioning quite well, and there's some really good working. But one of the issues I think Northern Irish politicians need to bear in mind is that they need to show constantly to a sceptical constituency that actually the institutions do work and can resolve not just the easy issues, but the difficult issues as well. And so I think that's something where it is a maturing democracy, but that could go further.
Now, this is a question we've asked everyone. Would you recommend the job? And bearing in mind, normally I say to a friend or someone you care about, but would you recommend it to your children to continue the Walker dynasty? Is politics a thing that you'd recommend to someone you cared about?
Yes, but with the understanding that it is incredibly challenging. And I always say when I speak in schools about politics, it is extraordinarily worthwhile. It can be incredibly rewarding, but it will always also be incredibly challenging and frustrating. And there are some things that you campaign on for years and years, and you don't move the dial. And so one of the things you have to grow accustomed to, I think, in politics is to a degree of disappointment that you can make the most brilliant speech in the world about something and actually nothing changes as a result. But equally, when you do move the dial, and usually with the help of a lot of other people, and usually with the help of forging alliances in unlikely places, it's incredibly worthwhile and valuable. And that's something that I think, whether it's select committee work, whether it's work in government, whether it's work on the backbenches, you can make a real difference. And that's why I'd recommend it. But I'd say to people, go in with your eyes open. It's never easy. It is always a big challenge to get a sensible work-life balance, and making sure that you can fit family around it and manage family well with it is a big challenge. And there are probably procedural things we could do to improve that. But at the end of the day, it's such an important job, but it's quite right that most of the time it comes first.
Finally, then, for last question, your exit interview, Conservative MP Robin Walker, what will you do next?
That's a very good question, and I keep telling my wife that I'd love to spend more time at home and write poetry. She seems to think I need to go out and make a living. So I suspect it is something that I shall be making sure I do the latter. But I haven't worked out the specific next step. I'm going to talk to some people. I'm going to look at what the opportunities are. Whatever those opportunities are, I will certainly keep an interest in and follow politics closely.
Well, Robin Walker, we really appreciate you joining us. It's for your exit interview. Conservative MP for Worcester, Robin Walker, thanks for joining us on Times Radio.
Thank you.